One of the great interpretive mysteries of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake has been how to characterize its aesthetics. Because Joyce shows his command of language here on a whole new level, where he presents us with a very condensed, very precise, very detailed, and almost mechanistic textual economy, which focuses, as economies do, on methods of production, on the way through which meaning, and indeed truth, is produced. Now, this is very much a theme that can be found among postmodern philosophers, and as such, Finnegans Wake really represents a rupture text between the modernist and postmodernist periods. And one of the things that really helps to bring this to the fore is discussing recitation and the role of the oral in Finnegans Wake. Because like any good piece of poetry, and I think Finnegans Wake could be called a piece of poetry at times, it is to be spoken, and it is the art of the written word that becomes flesh through the flesh, through not only thoughts, but through being a part of the world and performatively being invoked. And of course, performativity is a very important concept in postmodern philosophy. And indeed, when we try to talk about Finnegans Wake, when we try to say anything concrete or definite or certain about it, we must talk in generalities, which are far too inadequate, or particulars which get undercut by someone else who comes in and says, no, actually this word means this. I can trace this line through Joyce's text and show that this is the sort of continuity of voice that he's trying to establish here. And one thing that I would like to discuss in this lecture is the way that Joyce thematizes the concept of the production of truth and the multiplicity of truth. I'd like to first talk a little bit about how this concept works in pragmatist and postmodern philosophy, and then show how Joyce really brings that to the fore in Finnegans Wake through the problematic of a possible recitation of the text.
Well, you know, don't you tell us what happens, I told you. Every telling is a tailing, and that's the he and she. Look, the dust is there. My branch is lost, you're taking, and my cold chair's gone at.
Now, one of the philosophers who gives the production of truth its most erudite exposition is the philosopher William James, one of the early pragmatist philosophers in America. And William James says that truth happens to a thing, that truth is made, that something becomes true. It becomes true through entering into conversation, into critical conversation with our beliefs, our goals, our values, our presuppositions, and more. And this has to do with a change that was occurring in philosophy at the time of the late 19th and early 20th century, being pushed by a lot of pragmatist philosophers that wanted to do sort of soft-minded philosophy, which is to say, rather than being like Plato and trying to abstract away from human concerns to try to find the truth beyond human particularities, beyond the mere scope of our mortal lives. Instead, a lot of these pragmatist philosophers, and we could also probably include in here some of the late phenomenologists, perhaps Heidegger and Nietzsche and some other existentialist philosophers, human problems now become deeply philosophically influential, and we can see this, for example, in feminist philosophy, where a lot of feminists realize that, well, if we look at the way that philosophy is run on a sort of institutional level, it is overwhelmed almost exclusively by male figures, by male voices, by male bodies who come to stand for a status quo. And when we challenge that status quo, it forces us to call into question a number of presuppositions which are latent within the vocabulary and the way that we exercise discourse and the way that critical thought becomes manifest. And when we do that, we realize that a lot of our concepts were in fact not eternal truths from the beginning as we had supposed. Take, for example, the concept of rationality, which has seen a lot of critical study in post-colonial studies. Because one of the founding justifications for colonizing missions is what is called the white man's burden. This is a form of duty where, as a Westerner, say you're a Spaniard or a Frenchman or a Brit, and you are told that you have a burden to bring rationality, democracy, etc., to these backwards, uncivilized nations that would do better if they had it, and they just don't know what's good for them. So there becomes this us versus them mentality. And when we think about rationality or democracy, we think, yeah, these things would be good. Maybe if someone says they don't want this, maybe in fact they do need to be forced to have it. Maybe that would be better for them. Maybe they don't know what's good for themselves. But you can see that when we enter into this position, we start to raise ourselves above other human beings. We start to create a hierarchy by which we differentiate which bodies of community is the most efficacious for arriving at a truth claim. Some are seen as more reputable, as more trustworthy, as more erudite, as more educated, etc. And indeed, from certain perspectives, it is certainly the case that certain people are more or less educated, more or less erudite, more or less logical, etc. But of course, if we just try to appraise these lesser nations without taking into account the fact that they haven't had a lot of the institutions or concepts that Western culture has had in place for a comparatively longer amount of time, then we can't necessarily fault them for their supposed irrationality. And one of the things that we see in the history of philosophy, you can see this in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and David Hume, is that in fact rationality becomes associated with specific racial groups, specifically white men. Black men are seen as an inferior sort of animal. You can see this taken up in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, where he discusses the way in which growing up in a society where these sort of stereotypes exist causes one to have trouble being socialized because one cannot internalize a sense of self that isn't constantly in battle with itself. So the point is that when we take these fixed approaches to truth, where we assume that certain bodies are more validly able to come to truth claims than others, a priori, then we reach a sort of bigoted standstill where we are not able to open up our visor, our epistemological visor, and see the limitations of the perspective in which we lie. And of course, this doesn't mean that we need to reach some stultified sort of relativism where you have your truth and I have mine and we have no ability to even talk to each other. We don't have to do that. You might want to see Hilary Putnam's A Reconsideration of Dewey and Democracy, which I've done a lecture on, which discusses this very subject. But the point is that we need to talk about truth as something that is a lot more contingent than we would like to think. Not something transcendent, but eminently fought out in the realm of politics, of society, of the family, of gender, of sexuality, of coloniality, etc. And all of these cause us to realize the produced nature of, for example, racial truth. Race is a social construct. The value that we attach to race, the lines that we draw in the sands of the human genome and the variety of human phenotypes to say this is a race, this is a different race, this is a white man, this is a black man, this is a Latino, etc. I mean, all of these are very arbitrary, socially enforced and created lines that are true in a sense. I mean, it is true that these lines have impacts in our culture. Now, it is not the case that race is true in some sort of metaphysical sense. No, it is a performative category of identity and of subjugation and oppression, also of camaraderie and possibility. You know, this is not all a bad thing. But this has caused the pragmatist philosophers, William James being one of the great early pragmatist philosophers, to question humans' abilities to detach themselves from the reaching of knowledge. That in fact, what it means to say we know something and for it to be true, for it to be useful, for example. The idea of use is a perfect example. How can we talk of use independent of some entity for whom something is useful? For example, tearing in half my book, Finnegans Wake. Is that useful? Well, for me, no, it's not, because then I would no longer have a wonderful book to read. But maybe for my fiance or my roommates or my parents who don't want to hear me talking about the book anymore, maybe it would be very useful if I tore it in half. So we can see that the party, the entity in consideration, changes the ontological status of usefulness. It cannot be some independent category appraised, independent of whom it is relative to. Who is in question? Who is being brought into question, into critical focus in our discourse? And in fact, this can go for many other categories. And we can see this, for example, even in contemporary physics. In quantum physics, there are several new discoveries that have called into question the ability to talk about objective truth about physical matter. For example, the Newtonian universe understands that there are regular laws that apply to definite states of particles which make up this book here, and that I can get a set input and get a set output in my equation that can not only predict, but state, as a matter of fact, with 100% certainty, the physical matters of fact about this book. But quantum physics runs into a number of problems. For one, we have the problem of quantum indeterminacy, which relates to the difference between position and momentum of a quantum particle. When we get to the quantum level, to this ultra micro level, these two qualities of momentum and position are inversely proportional to one another, such that the more you know one, the more uncertain and unknowable the other one is. Thus, we cannot pinpoint the exact physical conditions and state of this quantum particle. There is always an amount of indeterminacy that comes at these levels, and it's not a problem of perception. In fact, when we are not perceiving a quantum particle, it is in a state of indeterminacy where it is in a superposition of multiple positions at once. And it exists as a probability density, as a circular wave that ramifies outwards with lesser and lesser potential to be found as you get further and further out from the center. So in fact, it is a very ontological fact about the world, the indeterminacy, that these liminal and indeed undecidable states of matter are part of the way that things work and that things are. In addition, we have realized that when we observe a quantum particle, we don't see this wave function, a probability density of uncertainty. We see a quantum particle because we found out that observation is a form of perturbation, that we enter onto and affect the system when we observe it. That to be even tacitly or objectively or neutrally engaged in a system through observation is to be bound up in its conclusion. It is to affect the state of the system and cause the wave function to collapse into a definite state of a quantum particle, which still has that problem of indeterminacy. Thus, contemporary theoretical physicists have realized that in fact we have reached a philosophical impasse where objective truth must be left in the dust. We must accept the illogicality of quantum superposition, of quantum indeterminacy, of this wave function of probability density that violates our notions of clear and definite states of every particle in existence that we had up to about the early 20th century. And all this shows that if we want to talk about the truth of a system, we have to talk about the observers of the system, the way they are interacting with the system and are caught up with and in that system. Thus, we cannot talk about truth outside of the economy of perception and of the articulation of a system that occurs through that perception, such that it is a very concretely known ontological fact that truth is not objective, that it is produced, and that it has to do with the relative understanding of for whom is it true and in what manner. Now, as tangential as this all may seem, it actually is explicitly thematized in Joyce's text because Finnegans Wake is the first time we see the word quantum theory. On page 149, he says, "I am working out a quantum theory about it, for it is really most tantumizing state of affairs." Right? Tantalizing and like tantrum-inducing. Right? And I think that's a really adequate way of describing quantum indeterminacy, which really stands for what Joyce's text as a whole is. It is an indeterminate conglomeration of layers and layers of meaning and multitudinous voices that intersect in a complex interplay of elements that does not have a set single truth. If you've ever tried to read Finnegans Wake's secondary literature, you will see that it is overwhelmed with the variety of critical perspectives, making very stark, very clear statements about lines of meaning and association that run throughout the whole of the text, skeleton keys that help make sense of this text as a whole. And in fact, it's fairly known by even most Wake scholars that this project is always doomed to fail. That, of course, we cannot reduce this text of utter multiplicity and ecstasy to a single line, to a single scheme, such as, for example, Vico's Cycles of History. This is an oft-repeated one, but much too inadequate to discuss the eschatology or the history or the causality present in Finnegans Wake. And all of these critical perspectives are trying to struggle with Joyce's textual economy, which really exemplifies this question of quantum indeterminacy and superposition. Because when we look at a page of Finnegans Wake, any page, you will find words which seem as if they could be alluding to or denoting more than one thing. Because, of course, words denote things. They articulate through their presence on the page some concept, some sound, some affect or feeling. And in Finnegans Wake, these are so layered together that in fact the project may seem impossible to pull any meaning out of the text, knowing that every strand that is pulled is in fact just one strand, that it is not the truth of the text. And this is really difficult when trying to state things about Finnegans Wake because, the majority of the things that I say about Finnegans Wake on this channel are about how indeterminate it is, about how no position is final. But I think this is actually a perfectly postmodern way of understanding truth and ontology itself. That we live in a processual world, a process unfolding itself with no final term. With no first term possibly either. That this is a constantly ramifying system whose means of articulation and judgment of itself are always undergoing change. Think about the criteria that we may use when looking at Finnegans Wake to judge whether or not we have a good interpretation, whether or not we've grasped Finnegans Wake. That is gone. We've so abandoned the normal course of language that we no longer have the fetters of knowing that we've done a good job, of having the pat on the back from the author to know that we have surmounted some mountain. It's almost like an infinite cascade of mountains where once you get to the peak, you realize that you have to go down a valley and come back to scale up yet again a higher mountain. And this, in fact, creates a problem when it comes to reciting the text. Recitation really brings to the fore all of the interpretive problems that are always latent in Finnegans Wake that one may be able to forget about if one just reads through the book silently and doesn't think about how to present it, how to oralize and auralize the text. Because Joyce's textual economy works by being very efficient with words, by packing as many denotations into as little space as possible. And this efficiency creates a problem when we consider that when we make the word flesh through our recitation, we are necessarily bound to truncate all of the lines and voices present orthographically on the page into one single line. We must round out the edges, the questions of uncertainty, and we must lower the text to the standard of understandable speech, where we have to choose oftentimes between words that could conceivably be denoted by this strange compound totem word that may be present on the page. And when we do that, in fact, we really show the inadequacy of the oral, and indeed of the oral, to adequately grapple with Finnegans Wake in its entirety. Because Joyce was very much influenced by Richard Wagner's concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk. And the Gesamtkunstwerk is the concept of a grand artwork that takes into account a number of different artistic domains and brings them all together in a sort of dialectical synthesis. Think about Wagner's operas, in which we have theater, poetry, symphonic music, vocal performance, dance, choreography, etc. All of these come together and they blend into an ecstatic unity of brilliance, oftentimes one that breaks down and there's not necessarily very perfect continuity across Wagner's project because the Gesamtkunstwerk is bound to fail because no representation, no articulation of thought and art is complete, is total, is without holes. But nevertheless, I think Joyce was trying to go for something with that, where he was trying to create the ultimate book that couldn't work if any of the senses were forsaken. Maybe with the exclusion of touch and smell. But at the very least, you had to have your eyes, and you had to have your inner ear, and you had to have your mouth too. You had to have the ability to see the words on the page and be able to cognize all the variety of denotations. You have to be able to oralize in one's mind's ear how that might sound, how that might affect one. You have the physiological sense of the feeling inside the mouth when one has to oralize and pronounce the text. And you also have the technical question of how to decide, as I said, which denotations are going to figure into your recitation. And you have an impossible project. I always am incredibly disappointed when I recite Joyce on the channel because I always realize the intense inadequacy of my recitation. Hence why I always, when I'm doing Finnegans Wake, show the text on the page. Usually I can kind of get away with just speaking very clearly, and there's no need for the text on the page. There's no kind of orthographic tricks going on that would make it where you utterly need to see the page. But with Finnegans Wake, I mean, this text is just, it's so full of mysteries and question marks and indeterminacy and multiplicity of association that it can't just go without the eye. That would be to forsake the text. And Clive Hart, in his structure and motif in Finnegans Wake, a profound piece of secondary literature, really showcasing some of the formal architecture in place in Finnegans Wake, mentions the inadequacy of oral presentations of Finnegans Wake. He states that the greater part of the meaningful counterpoint in Finnegans Wake cannot be orally communicated is revealed by Joyce's own celebrated reading from Anna Livia, the last chapter of Part 1, which, though finely orchestrated within a small compass, totally fails to convey more than one level of meaning from a representatively complex passage. In most cases, a variety of pronunciations is necessary for each word, and many phrases offer several possibilities of rhythm and stress. In theory, highly controlled choral speaking by a small group would be the only satisfactory solution to the problem of how to read Finnegans Wake aloud, each speaker adhering to one quote-unquote voice of the counterpoint and using the appropriate accent and stress. And funnily enough, even that concept of a choral recitation, of a sort of multitudinous, chaotic mess, even that is inadequate because we have the question of vocal primacy, of which voice is most primal on a hermeneutic level as we're going through the text. What is the most present as the kind of primary layer, and then there may be multiple layers below or above that, but we have one that kind of shows itself as the most prominent, and these are constantly slipping and sliding under one another, such that maybe it is possible to do some sort of crazy choral network where voices are constantly raising and lowering in dynamics and tempi and all these other such things. But the real point, without taking this analogy to too absurd of a degree, is that any recitation of Joyce's text fails in principle because a pure recitation without the visible text is bound to fail, bound to truncate and simplify the text. And in fact, the possibility of reifying the word is the very precondition for its failure as wordscape for Joyce. It is to really show the inadequacy of language, because it is indeed fantastically descriptive and imaginative, but word is an action. It is a performative, as many of the gender and queer and post-colonial theorists have taught us. So this performative requires being invoked. But to invoke it is to make it determinate, make it explicit, remove the ambiguity and the aesthetic flair that makes Finnegans Wake what it is. So it makes me a little dismayed that a proper recitation of Finnegans Wake is doomed to fail. But, and this is the real kicker that I wanted to mention here, is that it showcases one of the possibilities for the post-truth age. Richard Rorty, one of the later neo-pragmatists in the late 20th century and early 21st century, highlighted that it may be useful if we get rid of the notion of truth, and definitely of metaphysics, that we instead talk about justification instead of truth, for example. Because that brings to the fore the question of for whom is this justified? This is not justified to me, but it may be to you. And we can bring these dueling questions of value and of primacy into critical discourse with one another. But the important thing is that we have all the experimental possibilities ahead of us to make truth, and make a truth that can ecumenically coexist with other creations. This text can be rent in half through multiple recitations, through multiple attempts to render the text into the oral domain, and yet nevertheless it stays together better than any text. Because there are some senses in which one may be more favorable than the other, but we get to a limit when we must simply say that these are multiple different ways of articulating the truth of Finnegans Wake. There is no behind the curtain, so to speak, but just watching the curtain flutter. And I think that is one of the great excitements of the post-truth age, is that we are beyond metaphysics and back to art. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting and helpful. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to make a one-time donation to the channel, because it really helps me out, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.